Have you ever looked at a map of Africa and wondered why the borders are so straight? It's almost like someone drew them with a ruler. Well, in a way, they did. This isn't a story about ancient kingdoms or natural geography. It's the story of a dramatic and often brutal redrawing of a continent, a period known as the Scramble for Africa. Letty's journey back to the late 19th century to understand how this happened and what it meant for millions of people. For centuries, European powers had limited their presence in Africa mainly to coastal trading posts. The continent's interior was vast, mysterious, and largely unknown to them, but in the late 1800s, everything changed. A perfect storm of factors brewed in Europe. The Industrial Revolution created a massive demand for raw materials like rubber, cotton, and palm oil, all abundant in Africa. National pride and fierce competition between empires meant that claiming new territories was a symbol of power and prestige. Everyone wanted a piece of the pie. This frenzy culminated in the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884. Imagine this: leaders and diplomats from 14 European nations, plus the United States, gathered in a grand hall in Germany. They laid out a map of Africa on a table. But here's the most shocking part: not a single African leader was invited, not one. Over several months, they negotiated, argued, and ultimately carved up an entire continent among themselves, creating about 50 new territories with artificial borders that sliced right through existing ethnic groups, kingdoms, and cultural lands. With the map redrawn, the real process of effective occupation began. This was the rule set at the conference. To claim a territory, a European power had to have a physical presence there. This unleashed a wave of explorers, soldiers, and administrators across Africa. Their mission was to establish control, often through treaties with local chiefs who might not have fully understood what they were signing away, and when treaties failed, through overwhelming military force. One of the most notorious examples of this exploitation was in the Congo Free State. It wasn't a colony in the traditional sense, but the personal property of one man, King Leopold II of Belgium. He presented his venture as a humanitarian mission, promising to bring civilization and end the slave trade. But the reality was a reign of terror. The global demand for rubber was booming, and Leopold's agents forced the Congolese people to harvest it under brutal conditions. Failure to meet quotas was met with horrific punishments. This wasn't about building a nation. It was about extracting wealth at any human cost. It was a similar story across the continent, though the methods varied. In territories like British Kenya or French Algeria, fertile lands were seized from local populations and given to white settlers, pushing Africans onto less productive reserves. To make the colonies profitable, colonial governments imposed taxes, often payable only in the colonial currency. To earn this currency, Africans had no choice but to work for low wages in European-owned mines, on plantations, or in building infrastructure like railways. But these railways weren't built for the benefit of African people. They were designed to transport raw materials from the interior to the ports as quickly and cheaply as possible, to be shipped back to factories in Europe. This economic exploitation was justified by a deeply ingrained ideology of racial superiority. The concept of the civilizing mission was used to portray colonialism as a noble endeavor, a duty to uplift so-called backward peoples. This belief system was used to dismantle existing African political structures, suppress local cultures, and replace traditional education with a Western model that often taught Africans to see their own heritage as inferior. The goal was to create a compliant workforce and a class of subjects who accepted European rule as natural and beneficial. But the spirit of Africa was never broken. Resistance was a constant feature of the colonial era. From the very beginning, African communities fought back. There were large-scale armed conflicts like the Maji Maji Rebellion in German East Africa or the Ashanti Wars in modern-day Ghana. But resistance also took other forms. Workers went on strike, communities refused to pay taxes, and people found ways to preserve their culture and traditions in secret. A new generation of African intellectuals, many educated in Europe, began to use the colonizers' own language and ideas of liberty and self-determination to argue for independence. The two world wars were a major turning point. African soldiers fought and died for their colonial rulers in faraway lands, and their experiences broadened their horizons and fueled their desire for freedom. The wars also weakened the European powers, both financially and morally. In the years after World War II, a wave of nationalism swept across Africa. Charismatic leaders like Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, and Senghor in Senegal rose to lead powerful independence movements. Through protests, political negotiation, and sometimes armed struggle, one by one, African nations began to reclaim their sovereignty. The 1960s, in particular, became the year of Africa, with many countries achieving independence. It was a time of incredible hope and celebration, but the legacy of colonialism runs deep. Those straight lines drawn on a map in Berlin a century earlier left behind a complex inheritance of political instability, ethnic tensions, and economies that were still heavily dependent on exporting raw materials. Understanding this history is not about placing blame, it's about recognizing the complex and often painful forces that have shaped our modern world. It's about acknowledging the resilience and strength of the African people who resisted, endured, and ultimately reclaimed their destiny. The story of Africa is a story of incredible diversity, ancient civilizations, and a vibrant future being built by its people today. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through a pivotal chapter of history. If you found this insightful, please hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into our shared past, and let me know your thoughts in the comments below. See you next time.